Welcome back, and we're in the third part of the lesson. I hope to keep this short too, but it might run about 30-40 minutes. We're talking specifically about the Essenes and the community at Qumran, which, if you've ever heard of these people, these are the people responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to be talking about the Essenes and the Qumranite Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls in today's lesson. So if we flip down, here's actually a picture of all of the sources that we've used so far, if you're curious. I used all of these books in our lessons so far. Hopefully it adds some credibility to what I'm saying. I'm not just making stuff up off the top of my head. But beside from that, let's just get into the lesson. So what is an Essene? We talked about this last time, right? Either from Aramaic or Greek, it means something like a chassid, or a holy person, which it's basically the same connotation. And it's similar to how the Pharisees saw themselves, which Purush, or Purushim, which is where Pharisees, the name, comes from, means separated ones. So that's what holy means, right? You are sanctified, you're holy, you're separated, you're unique, you're a weirdo. In a good way. It's kind of like the that commercial that's going around now. I went crazy in a good way, right? But these people aren't going crazy. These people, they might have been seen as crazy, but they weren't. They were actually just very pious people. However, the Essenes were the least Hellenized sect out of the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. They were the least Hellenized. They were the most, I don't want to say that they were the most Judaic, but they were just simply the least Hellenized because they were so isolated. They lived isolated lifestyles, and although they were very similar to the Pharisees, in fact, some Pharisees may have kind of gone the next step and become Essenes, but being a Pharisee was totally fine. The Pharisees lived basically everywhere. The Essenes also lived basically everywhere, but at least in today's lesson, we're going to be talking specifically about the Essenes who lived at Qumran. So, while the Pharisees would send out missionaries to Greek-speaking cities, the Essenes would not do that. And we actually see these, what you might call evangelical Pharisees, in places like Matthew 23:15 and in the book of Acts. However, some of those Pharisees in the book of Acts could have actually been Pharisaic Nazarenes who were already believers. Another difference between the Essenes and the Pharisees were that the Pharisees were not totally disconnected from politics. They kept at a distance, but they were not totally cut off. Kind of like superheroes. They'd intervene when they really needed to, but they liked to stay behind the scenes. Some of them were more political than others as well. And this was different from the Essenes because the Essenes wouldn't get involved with Judean politics at all. They said, to heck with it, we are done. This is the last straw. We're tired of this. So where did the Essenes live? Well, according to Josephus, they lived in every town, which is not to be taken literally, but it means that they lived all over the place in Judea, a little bit up into Syria, too, because there was large Jewish populations up there, too. They tended to live in villages, not cities, according to Philo, who was an Alexandrian Jew who lived in the 1st century, and according to Pliny, who was a Roman historian, there was a settlement at En-Gedi, which is believed to be Qumran. I'm sorry, En-Gedi and also Qumran, and these places are not very easily accessible. They're out in the middle of nowhere. So the feeling that we get is that they lived basically everywhere, because Josephus says they lived in every town. Pliny says that they lived in these isolated places, but he never says whether they lived in towns or not. So what we can conclude is that they basically lived everywhere. Also, according to Essenic literature, there was an Essene community in the city of Damascus. And what's interesting is that the Essenes in Damascus thought that they were going to Damascus to establish the new covenant there. which I believe we'll be getting into in this presentation. Now, similarities with the Pharisees. In terms of their beliefs, they believed in an oral tradition, just like the Pharisees. They believed in resurrection, judgment, paradise, and Gehenna. We see Yeshua also using that terminology. The Essenes believed in spirits, the immortality of the soul, and other things like that. They also believed in secret knowledge that came from angels and other just mystical things, right? They were into what you might call mystical Torah study, or Merkava mysticism, which is actually the basis for Kabbalah. And if you've heard of Kabbalah, you've probably heard of the fake Kabbalah, not the authentic, kosher, Jewish Kabbalah. If when I say Kabbalah you're thinking of Madonna, this is the fake Kabbalah that we're talking about. Kabbalah at its heart is Torah study. If you ever hear of Kabbalah that has nothing to do with, God, with the Bible, then it's fake Kabbalah. It's not actually real Kabbalah. People have taken it and made it into their own thing. But the Essenes were studying and developing and theorizing and studying these things that were basically the basis for Kabbalah, called Merkava mysticism. Which, by the way, if you think mysticism is a bad word, it is literally all over the New Testament. So we'll be getting into that. It's not scary. It can oftentimes be a very good thing. Even when Yeshua says certain things like, I and the Father are one, that is a mystical statement, right? We see that actually appearing in Kabbalistic literature as well. But enough of that. In terms of their practices, similarities with the Pharisees in terms of practices, they had ritual water immersion and washings. So they believed in baptism. The Pharisees and the Essenes believed in baptism. The Sadducees did not. They did not baptize, they did not believe in baptizing, and maybe they never even took a bath. I don't know. Maybe that's why they were always arguing. But this practice actually comes from the Hasidic tradition. So when we see that Yeshua says to his disciples, go out and ritually immerse people in water, baptize them in my name, he's drawing a practice from this group of people, the Hasidim. The Essenes also had Tefillin, the phylacteries that they would bind on their arms and on their foreheads. They had structured prayer, like different prayers that they would read or memorize, just like the Pharisees. And they adopted various Levitical practices and tweaked them to make them appropriate for doing outside the temple. So, for example, they would not be slaughtering animals, but at the time that there would be sacrifices in the temple, that's when they would pray. Because David says that sacrifices are likened to prayer. And I think it says somewhere in the later prophets that the sacrifices of oxen are also likened to prayer. It's something like that. If you were interested, I could look it up for you. It's real easy. But they adopted some of these practices, and also some of the holiness aspects of the priesthood too, such as washing your hands, which that's even debatable because we find it in the Psalms. David does it. But again, that's for another time. Now the differences with the Pharisees. The Essenes believed in fate and basically no free will. Humans had free will, but whether it changed things or not, there was some ambiguity, or not ambiguity, but they weren't sure. All they knew is that we need to do something. We have a mission. God has a mission. We both need to do our mission, and that's it. Whether we succeed or not in changing the world, it doesn't really matter because God's going to do it anyways. They also considered the Pharisees too lenient. To them, the Pharisees were the liberals. The Essenes were the ultra-conservatives. They called the Pharisees shoddy wall builders, or basically crappy fence makers. The fences that the Pharisees put around the Torah weren't good enough for the Essenes, so the Essenes went a step further and said we need to be even more strict. Like I said, the Essenes were the least Hellenized sect. They lived in isolated lifestyles, whereas the Pharisees lived everywhere. They were disconnected from politics, unlike the Pharisees. They were also a non-proselytory sect, unlike the Pharisees. So basically, they didn't go advertise, here, join the Essenes today and get $50 off your yearly subscription. They stayed to themselves. They did not want people coming in. If people came to them, they said, I'd love to be an Essene, can I join you? They say, sure, go through our conversion program and you'll be set to go. But they didn't invite people in. But for those who wanted to join, from what we know, they were actually accepting. The Pharisees, on the other hand, did send out missionaries. They did try to draw people into Judaism. They did try to draw Gentiles into the biblical way of doing things. And again, this should set off all these bells in your head. This is what Yeshua and the apostles were doing. Go unto all nations and teach them what I taught you. Yeah, exactly. You're right. You're making connections. Or maybe I just made a connection for you. I don't know. But maybe we're both making connections. But in terms of the Levitical rituals outside the temple, it included daily immersion, which Pharisees didn't do. They would not baptize every day. That would maybe be before the holidays, or if they had come in contact with something unclean. Now, what's interesting is that modern Hasidic Jews, some of them also immerse in the mikveh daily. Not all of them. Some will do it right before the Sabbath, but some will even do it every single day. Even Jews living in icy parts of Russia. They'll go outside, they'll run real quick, dunk in the icy cold mikveh, and run back inside. Which I don't think that I'd ever do that, but I gotta give them props. That's pretty hardcore. But what's interesting, they can trace this practice all the way back to the Essenes 2,000 plus years ago. Now, in terms of Essenic beliefs, there was abstinence from taking oaths. They didn't believe in taking oaths, but rather just your word was your word, basically. Although to become an Essene, you had to take one oath. That was the only oath that you'd ever take. And this is similar to Matthew 5:34, where Yeshua says, "Let your yes be yes, your no be no," and don't mess around with making oaths. The Essenes were also into simplicity and living a modest, humble lifestyle, which is comparable to 1 Thessalonians 4:11. I personally believe that Paul had some kind of connection with the Essenes, not just because of this verse, but because of other verses too. And if that was the case, if that theory is correct, it would make sense. The Essenes also interpreted scriptures not just through the literal interpretation, but also allegorically or mystically. They believed in unalterable fate, meaning nothing can change from God's plan. God doesn't change his mind. Even when it looks like he changes his mind, he doesn't actually change his mind. They thought that their interpretation was divinely inspired, meaning that they believed that they had the Holy Spirit. They also thought that the sons of light and the angels would eventually overthrow all evil regimes in the world and bring about the Messianic age. So basically, the Essenes would team up with the angels and somehow destroy every evil rule in the world, and this would usher in the Messiah. Which, this Messianic tendency in the Essenes should again spark some interest, because we're relating them back to the Nazarenes, right? We're trying to look for similarities, because we know that there were some similarities, and as we'll be getting into, the Nazarenes were actually a later developed branch of the Hasidim. So, again, this makes sense that the Essenes would have this Messianic flair to them. Again, the Essenes had ritual meals designed to imitate the meals of the meal of the Messiahs. This is their language. And we can see this in Luke 22 and Revelation 19, where the believers, these Messianic believers, are having some kind of ceremonial meal with the Messiah. The Essenes believed in the same thing. Now, unlike the Nazarenes, The Essenes, and this is actually similar with the Pharisees, or eventually what the Pharisees would become, they believed in two messiahs. The Pharisees believed in Mashiach ben David and Mashiach ben Yosef, the Messiah son of David and Joseph, those two. The Essenes believed, though, in the Messiah's son of Aaron and David, so a king Messiah and a priestly Messiah. Another account from Josephus, the Essenes are Jews by birth and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. So, again, it's what we were talking about earlier with the Pharisees and with the disciples of Jesus, right? They will know you by, or they will know that you are my disciples by your love for one another. It's love. Now, did the Essenes or Pharisees do away with the Torah because of love? No. On the contrary, it made them try even harder to be stricter in their observance of the commandments. These Essenes reject pleasures as an evil, but consider continence and the conquest over our passions to be a virtue. So basically, they tame their passions. They control themselves. They try to get rid of the greed and the lust and the temptations in themselves. Which sounds like Yeshua and Paul, maybe? According to Pliny, who is the Roman historian, he says, the solitary tribe of the Essenes, which is remarkable beyond all other tribes of the whole world, as it is not women, and has renounced all sexual desire, has no money, and has only palm trees for company. Day by day, the throng of refugees is recruited to an equal number by numerous ascensions of persons tired of life and driven there by the waves of fortune to adopt their manners. So basically, Pliny, the historian, is saying, these people are amazing because there's no women, but their size does not diminish. And not only do they not have any women in this tribe, he called them a tribe, but they are celibate. They renounced all sexual desire. They don't have any money because they have things in common. And they're out in the middle of nowhere. You know, the palm trees are their company. But still, people are coming to them every day. He says every day, but it's not literally every day. People are constantly coming to them. Why? Because they're helping. They are helpful people. As they say, these people, to an equal number by numerous ascensions of persons tired of life and driven there. They're just tired of life. They're worn out. I've had it with the world. I'm done with the world. It wasn't working. It's not working. I want to be an Essene and just leave it all behind. The Essenes, according to Philo. Again, Philo is an Alexandrian Hellenistic Jew living in Egypt. There was actually a large Jewish population living in Egypt, and it did for centuries. He says, they are, above all, especially devoted to the service of God, not sacrificing living animals, because remember, they weren't in the temple, they couldn't legally do that, but studying rather to preserve their own minds in a state of holiness and purity. These men live in villages, avoiding all cities on account of the habitual lawlessness of those who inhabit them. Of these men, some cultivating the earth and others devoting themselves to those arts which are the result of peace, benefit both themselves and all those who come in contact with them, not storing up treasures of silver and gold. So basically they are a peaceful people who they're vegetarians, they're working the land, and they leave society because they're tired of worldliness. So that's all great, but how do you actually become an Essene? Well, Essene initiates were given a hatchet, an apron, white garments, and they were put on a 3-year probationary period consummated by an oath. And the consummation oath was for the person to act justly or piously toward God and to people. Love God and love your neighbor, right? The top 2 commandments. It's another similarity. To uphold secrecy of Essenic practices, which is not like the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes actually went out and taught people, kind of like the Pharisees. They were to guard the secret names of angels. The Essenes studied angelology, I guess you could call it. They were to transmit Essene teachings to the next generation of Essenes. So they had an obligation to teach people at a certain point. Upon completing their initiation, Essenes could participate in communal meals, and this is similar to Jude 1 and 1 Corinthians 11. There was also the abandonment of private property, as we already covered, and this is similar to when the apostles had everything in common. Which again, does that mean that the apostles were influenced by the Essenes? No. But it does mean that a lot of these practices go back to a common root, that all three of these sects, the Pharisees, Nazarenes, and Essenes, were drawing from. Now, in terms of classes, or ranks, as I guess you'd say, only men could become Essenes. So there was no female Essenes. And this is partly because they were trying to kind of diminish or put off their sexual desires. They didn't want to be tempted with that anymore, and they didn't want that obligation or burden. And so they thought that it would be best to not to even get involved with any of that. So if there were any children there, they would be educated in the ways of the Essenes. And it's possible that when John the Baptist was living out in the wilderness, he, according to ancient Christian legends, he was brought out there as a child. And so this might have actually been a policy that the Essenes exercised on John the Baptist. We don't know. Whether it happened or not, I don't think there's any proof either way, but it's a possibility. Social status was also, ironically, very important and determined who would be served first at festive meals. So, I think that the system, I haven't studied this in a little while, but I think it was first the priests who would be served first, and then everybody else. And in ancient Christian literature that didn't make it into the Bible, there's a similar policy whereby the prophets, the Christian prophets, would be served first and then everyone else. I don't know if that's related to this specific Essenic practice, but it might have been. The Essenes themselves were ex-priests who left the temple, Hasidim who allied with the priests, and people who were just sick of worldly living. Continuing with Essenic practices, in terms of modesty and moderation, which were basically the same thing, bathroom and mikveh habits. They would be fully, or at least, they'd be fully, or at most, partially clothed. Nudity was never an option. You never do that. It's unthinkable to the Essenes that you would ever be naked, right? In terms of their clothing, they would never wear revealing clothes. Everyone wore, and remember, these are all men, everyone wore all white robes, and they did not anoint themselves with oil. So they didn't believe in using things like this. In terms of intimacy, some Essenes were celibate, although there were some Essenes that did not renounce marriage. And by the way, those who did not renounce marriage, they needed the permission of their wives to become Essenes. They couldn't just do it, because sexual intimacy from a biblical point of view is owed to the wife, and so the man cannot just simply say, we're not going to be doing that anymore. He needs his wife's permission. And so if the wife said yes, then they could become Essenes, or at least he could, and perhaps the wife would live on the premises, but she would not herself become an Essene. If it doesn't make sense, it's because it's a very foreign system, and we don't really have anything like this nowadays, so it can be a little strange. And then sometimes, for those who were not completely celibate, they simply abstained from that kind of intimacy with their wives while their wives were pregnant. So for almost a year at a time. Because the 9 months of the pregnancy and then a few months after the child is born for the wife to heal. So this is a kind of a part-time celibacy, I suppose you could call it. In terms of wealth, the Essenes practiced communalism, not communism, but communalism, which is community-based. It's not just me based. There was also not much economic participation with outsiders. So in terms of what they needed, in terms of food or tools or anything else, they were on their own. They were not going to trade with other people or outsiders. They were agriculturalists and craftsmen, which, again, these occupations would be done by the poorer classes, the poorer people. And if we remember, the Pharisees were on the side of the poor and the less poor. Not quite the middle class, there was no middle class, but the slightly less poor. So it makes sense that these other Hasidim would also be poorer. And what's interesting, one of the early names for the really early Christians that were still fully Jewish, they were called Ebionim, or Ebionites, which means the poor ones. That's something that we can get into later, though. Continuing with Essene practices, in terms of the Sabbath, they were extremely rigid. They would not even save a life if it involved violating an aspect of Shabbat. They would not use the bathroom because what they would normally do is that they'd dig a hole and they'd go in that hole and then they'd bury it. You can't do that on the Sabbath. And so what they would do, they would hold it all day. And also, washing afterwards would require, just in practical terms, it would require work. And so they just wouldn't do these things all day. Which I don't know how they got through that, but somehow they managed to. Something that particularly stands out to me is that they would not even save life if it involved work. Like, for an example, if somebody's drowning in a lake, they would not break off a stick from a tree, which is, according to the biblical definition of work, that is work. They can't do that, stick it out into the lake, and save the person drowning. What they can do is that they can take off, if they have a jacket or something, they can take off their jacket or something, or maybe even an outer robe, so long as they're not exposing themselves to nudity. And, maybe hold on to one end and throw it to the other person. But they would not jump in and save the other person. Because remember, they believe that everything is God's will. If you're drowning, obviously God wants you dead. Sorry, it sucks to be you. Now, it seems heartless, but there is actually somewhat of a righteous rationale behind this, because they're trying to keep God's commandments. However, as Yeshua would say, they're misprioritizing. It's good to do what they were doing, but it's even better to do what they were not doing, which is saving life, because life is above almost every other commandment. And this is a position that would eventually be taken by the Pharisees, who they would say, look, we're not a bunch of crazy wackos who won't save somebody's life just because it's Shabbat, the Sabbath. Because, okay, we'll break the Sabbath once, but by saving that person's life, that person can keep the Sabbath for how many more years? So, overall, it's better. And that was their policy. And that was actually Yeshua's policy too, that it is good to do good on the Sabbath. As we covered in one of our other presentations, we're not going to go through the whole thing, but in the 2nd to 3rd centuries BCE, so about 200 years before Jesus came on the scene, they actually found Essene Tefillin. Remember, these are the things that you bind to your arms and to your heads. There's straps. They look kind of like strings, but they're straps that you bind these boxes to your bicep, to your left bicep, and to your forehead. And they've actually found Essene Tefillin. which means that this practice goes all the way back to at least that time. And we have hard evidence of it. It exists. We can look at it. In terms of literary evidence, we see that it goes back even a few centuries before that, at the latest. And because it was considered a tradition at that time, it would have had to exist before then. Because something I started yesterday is not a tradition. It would have had to be a while ago. So here are some pictures of those Essene Tefillin and the Tefillin houses, or boxes. And as we can see, they were much smaller back then. Nowadays, you can fit maybe 2 in your hand. Depending on the size of your hand, I guess I can fit about 2 in my hand. Each one being maybe 1.5 inches wide, I would guess. That's real rough. In terms of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, which were apparently written by Essenes, we're just going to be briefly covering these. We might be covering them in the next lesson, too. But there were, in the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's something called the Damascus document. And it talks about how the Essenes, it's basically the constitution of the Essenes living in Damascus. It's their founding document. It's like the Mayflower Compact, if you're familiar with colonial American history. The Essenes went to Damascus. They wrote up this Jewish constitution, so to speak, and they said, "We are here to establish the new covenant." Which, again, should set up alarms saying that these people valued the soon coming new covenant. This is something that we read about in the New Testament, right? We also find this interesting document that is cleverly named 4QMMT. I'm just joking. But 4QMMT has a very interesting phrase that we find nowhere in any literature that we know of other than 4QMMT and Galatians. These 2 documents have this key phrase that nowhere else exists. And the Essenes write concerning some works of the law. These works of the law, mentioned in Galatians, quite possibly refer to these works of the law that are mentioned in 4QMMT. And it's not necessarily talking about keeping the commandments, but rather the works of the law from an Essene point of view were these special things that the Essenes themselves had designed. You might call them Essene halakha. They were peculiar Essene practices that nobody else practiced. And it's possible that the Essenes had been influencing some of the early believers. And when Paul says, you know, we don't have to do the works of the law, it's very possibly a reference to some of these Essene practices that Paul disagreed with. There's also something called the Melchizedek document, or the Melchizedek document. And in this document, it talks about how Melchizedek is going to return, and he is basically the Messiah. It's a long story, and it's kind of complicated sometimes, but that's the gist of it. That Melchizedek would one day return to save the sons of light. Which, if that doesn't sound like Hebrews, well, it does sound like Hebrews. That's the point. Did the writer of Hebrews draw from this Essene document? Who knows? We don't even know who wrote Hebrews. But you can see how it's a similar idea. Maybe they're both drawing it from a different source. Or maybe the writer of Hebrews was an Essene. Who knows? But again, it's regardless of how it got into Hebrews, we see that it's similar. So in terms of the Essene beliefs regarding the New Covenant and the Damascus document, here's some of the things that it says. Essene initiates, people who want to become Essenes, must keep the Sabbath day according to the specification, meaning how we interpret the Sabbath, and the holy days, and the fast days, the days that you fast on, you don't eat, according to the commandments of the members of the new covenant in the land of Damascus. So here it plainly tells you that Essene initiates have to abide by the rules of the Essenes because they've come here to establish the new covenant, which in their minds requires Torah observance. It has nothing to do with doing away with the Torah, God forbid. But they've done this so that they can keep Torah even better. They say elsewhere, "So it is with all the men who entered the new covenant in the land of Damascus. They are all who joined the company of the men of holy perfection." Again, the new covenant in their minds had to do with Torah observance. It had nothing to do with doing away with the Torah. Also, the Qumranites, the people living in Qumran, were led by a teacher of righteousness, which people have speculated who this person is. There's no hard proof for any of their opinions. I've heard a number of them. Some of them are kind of crazier than others, but what's interesting is that the Qumranites were led by this one guy, and it kind of reminds us of the Nazarenes being led by one guy, which is Jesus, right? Yeshua, who led this sect of Hasidim, the Nazarenes. Now, in terms of John the Baptizer, the Nazarene connections, we see in Matthew 3, verse 1, and there's an early Christian document called the Infancy Gospel of James, and it's in line 22. Now, this is not in the Bible. This is just a legend, which legends often have a little kernel of truth, and then they're exaggerated over time. That's usually how legends work. Even legends about huge supernatural things usually have a kernel of truth to them, with a lot of extra non-true details. So in terms of the location of where John the Baptizer lived and grew up and where he was born, it says, "And when Herod," remember this is the one who was persecuting people all the time, "and when Herod knew that he had been mocked by the Magi, in a rage he sent murderers, saying to them, 'Slay the children from 2 years old and under.' And Elizabeth, having heard that they were searching for John, took him and went up into the hill country, and kept looking where to conceal him. There is no place of concealment. And Elizabeth, groaning with a loud voice, says, 'O mountain of God, receive this mother and child.'" Kind of reminds you of when Yeshua says, "Just a little bit of faith can move mountains," right? Maybe this story was based off of that, I don't know. But regardless, they flee into the wilderness, and immediately the mountain was opened and received her. And a light shone about them, for an angel of the Lord was with them, watching over them. So, basically the gist of the story is that Herod is about to kill all the babies, and Elizabeth and John, they escape into the wilderness. Now you ask, where is Zechariah? Well, Zechariah gets murdered by Herod in this story. Now, John the Baptist also had an ascetic diet. I mean, it's kind of this harsh, strict diet. In terms of what asceticism is where you basically afflict your body. You live a very mean or poor or below average lifestyle, so that you're not constantly focusing on the physical, but on spiritual things. So he had an ascetic diet. It was very plain. And he had very plain clothing, according to Matthew 3:4, right? He's eating honey and locusts. He's wearing a camel rug, basically. Now, John is preaching and immersing people in the river, right? And these were things that were commanded by the order of the Essenes, to teach people the way of the Essenes and to immerse. He anticipated the coming of another teacher of righteousness. Remember, at Qumran, they were led by a teacher of righteousness, and then John, who very possibly knew about this teacher of righteousness, is baptizing in the wilderness, saying, "There is another teacher of righteousness who's greater than me. I'm not even worthy to undo his sandals, the strap of his sandals." And there's more. John's father was a priest. Remember, Zechariah was a priest. And so John was eligible for the priesthood. He was a Cohen. He was a priest. Now this fits very well with what we know about the Essenes so far. Now, here's Josephus's account about John the Baptizer. Josephus actually writes a little bit about what John was doing, what John was like. He says, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews irate both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And love God." If we remember, this was also the way that the Pharisees treated themselves, according to Josephus. And so to come to baptism, or immersion, right? For that the washing would be acceptable to him if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away of some sins, but for the purification of the body. So what's fascinating is that Josephus is actually verifying what the New Testament says about John. He's in the wilderness, he's drawing people to righteousness, he's telling people and teaching people piety toward God, to love one another, and to immerse and to be washed. Which these are all Essenic practices. Now lastly, Nazarene connections with the Essenes in regards to Yeshua, Paul, and others. Yeshua apparently never married. It's possible that he did. It's possible that maybe his wife died before they had any children, because we know that Yeshua never had any children. But it's very probable that he never married, right? There's no wife ever mentioned in the Gospels. Even in early Christian traditions, nobody talks about Yeshua being married. And me personally, I have no problem whether he was or wasn't. I wish that he was. It'd make for a very interesting story. But that's not what the facts say. He probably never married. And this is something that the Essenes did. Does this mean that Jesus was influenced by the Essenes? No. But it does mean that it might go back to this similar mindset that the Hasidim had. That certain Hasidim had. Not all of them, but some of them. Also, Paul appears to have taught celibacy, or conditional celibacy, in 1 Corinthians 7. Both Yeshua and Paul had a prophetic or apocalyptic mindset. Paul had secret knowledge of an angelic language in 1 Corinthians 13:1. Remember when he says, "For even if I speak to you in the tongues of angels?" Tongues of angels, where do we ever read about that in the Bible? Paul knew about something that most people didn't. Paul knew a man who ascended into the third heaven in a vision, similar to the Essene Merkaba mysticism, and Paul's account of this is in 2 Corinthians 12:2. Also, Jude, the Apostle Jude, quotes the book of Enoch, 1 Enoch, in Jude 1:14, which is not a book in the Bible, and it's not even necessarily entirely true. Maybe the book during Jude's day was totally kosher, but maybe nowadays it's not. But regardless, the book of Enoch was used by the Essenes, and it was a mystical text, or had mystical material in that text. And so we're seeing, hopefully, certain things that the Hasidim, both similarities with the Pharisees and the Essenes, these things lining up with what the Nazarenes were doing and teaching and preaching. And so that ends today's lesson about the Essenes. We went a little bit longer than I had hoped, but kept it shorter than what I was fearing. So, again, I will leave you with this. If you need to go back and review, you're more than welcome to. Stay blessed. Have a wonderful day. Be Hasidim. Go above the letter of the law. Be good to one another. Love God. Love your neighbor. And we will talk to you later. Have a good day.